Hey there, guys, and welcome back. So, we've got another 2 hours in the books here, and frankly, one of these deals where I can't say it's been my most productive 2 hours. We got a decent amount done. It's just a matter of a lot of it was reorganizing code, unfortunately. So, let's go ahead and hop through it. I guess I'll hop over to game because that's the biggest changes. So, game, as you can see, is suddenly a significantly smaller. And the reason for that is that 90% of the code that we had in here was demo code. And it didn't make sense for it to be in game. I knew it didn't make sense. It's just one of those things, again, trying to get the demo up as quickly as possible meant that it went into game so that I didn't have to worry about stuff. So, made the demos file now, and now we have combat demo and a quick reference to map demo. So combat demo, it's one of those things. It's basically everything that was in game with minor modifications to make it work. One thing I will modifications just reference game instead of this in many places. So you can see this used to be this.strings, for example. So that's a pretty minor change, all said and done. However, it is something that took some time to check and double check and then make sure that everything was in place. One thing I do want to mention is, as I was moving the code over and double checking it all, I had dot bind this on all these event listeners, and it was totally unnecessary. One of those things, as I've said before, I'm just trying to bang out code, and therefore I just got paranoid, I assume, and just went, you know what, screw it, we're just going to bind this to everything, so that we always have access to the game object in case we need it inside of these callback functions. None of these callback functions really needed it. Actually, I think a couple of them did, but that's beyond the point. Let's see. Let's take a quick look. One of those things. No, actually, I don't think any of them did. I take it back, because we had access to the events, and otherwise I was using stuff like output to fight log, which already, because it was in the scope, had access to the game. So actually, that one didn't even need access to the game, did it? Point being is that I put a bunch of extraneous code in there, and we fixed that problem. So that is that. Let's see. After game and demos is oh, this one is important. This one is very important. So the first hour is basically getting demos set up. Actually, I guess I should just hop over to, we made a minor change up here in demos. So since we have more than one demos, I want to be able to just toggle all the demo buttons on and off. So we have that there. We have this list of demo buttons so we can create the buttons dynamically and then toggle them on and off dynamically. So those are things that got added to the demos file that were not in the games file. And then over here on LiteLike, the homepage, as you can see, we added the demos file here. I got rid of the stuff that called game itself. I just did that over in the demos file. And then I just made this so that everything in the menu div here is displayed as block, and that just basically takes all our buttons and displays them vertically instead of horizontally. So those are the rest of those changes in that vein. Now we get to important things. So as I started working on the map, and let's pull that up. Before I even got this far, honestly, as soon as I got this far, just had this written, nothing else in this file. Okay, ignore everything else in the file for the moment. It's one of those things that I realized that I was going to need to add things to the character. And what I decided to do is I took the original character that we had in here and changed it into combat character. So the combat character is everything you knew and love about the character. Just renamed it and rebranded the combat character. And the second important change is that I am not copying over these arrays anymore. That way, when we create this combat character, off of our new player character, which looks a heck of a lot like it because, let's face it, it's going to have all the same attributes. It's just going to copy itself for combat. That way, when it passes in its armor and its weapons and etc., and its statistics, more importantly, for example, its HP, those objects are actually passed in and not copied. They aren't copied over, which means that the originals get updated in place as well. So when the character loses HP in the demo, at the end of the demo, we can look at the character's HP on just the player character object, and it will have the same amount of HP it had when we exited combat. So all that stuff becomes persistent, which is very useful. So that is the first important change on the character, the whole entire character situation. So we took what we had, made it combat specific, because fact of the matter is that the player character is not always in combat, and we need statistics outside of combat. So as you can see, I added in here vision. This is the thing that prompted me, because in order to explore the map, the player needs vision, and I didn't want to add vision to the combat portion because the combat portion doesn't care about vision. So that is the rationale. And then, as you can see, we just have this get combat character function, and for whatever reason, I just derped and did not complete that. But what do you call it, documentation there. But it just returns a new combat character, and it copies over the statistics and whatnot. So that is easy enough. That was easy enough to implement. The next thing that caused to break is over here in IO, and not necessarily caused, but obviously needed to be updated. So instead of this being character, it is now player character and combat character. So that's how we go in and get our strings now. So that is an easy enough change, and let's glance at the rest of this stuff, at the rest of the changes. Where do we want to go next? I guess at this point, so that was all those things I've listed were in the first hour. The second hour, as I said, was not nearly as productive, and that's because I was really starting to think about what exactly we needed in order to make all this work. And honestly, I may just be having a slow day. That was obviously, as you could tell from the README. Let's go ahead and open the README back up really quick. And that was today, so maybe I'm just having a slow day today. But regardless, I guess the next thing we will talk about is... Yeah, I guess we just stick on map, and we'll talk about what we have to add there. So the map, obviously, I had to set up a map size, home coordinate. This stuff could be, well, this one specifically could be dynamic, but I figured may as well hard code it, so no big deal. And I'm going to skip over this for just a second, the movement cost, but the map size, I got to double check that one. I think the map in A Dark Room was 21 by 21, I think, and then your center point was 1010, but I have to double check that. That's just kind of off of an intuitive memory. And then obviously we set the player location. This was the next thing I wrote. And then I just wrote a quick movement function right here, which one of those things like any other movement function. Actually, I went over a few different ways to do this in the stream animation program. I talked about different methodologies that you could use, and I never started my music, so here's some background music. I mean, this is going to be a short stream, but enjoy the background music while it lasts. I talked about a few different programmatic methodologies that could be used to manipulate coordinates. I'm going very simply here. We have 4 cardinal coordinates. The game itself, you could only move up, down, left, right. You can't move diagonally in the game in A Dark Room, so that's all we're worried about here. And since each of those directions only affects one, I just put this switch case in here and manipulated in place the coordinate. So that was, again, just a very simple and dirty way of moving the character. We make sure the character is still on the map. So if the character is at the edge of the map and he tries to move right, nothing happens, does not cost fuel, does not do anything else. And then if it did move, however, so this is if it did move, because we're assuming it moved because it did not go off the map. If it moves and goes off the map, then it does not move, and therefore if it did not go off the map, it did move. You understand the logic there? So if it did not go off the map, then it is moving this turn with this movement call, and therefore we can update the player location and then subtract fuel and repair costs. Now, this is where I started really thinking about how we are going about this, because our theme is a little bit different. Well, our theme is a lot different from a dark room, and even so, there are some mechanics in our game that do not function exactly like a dark room, and that was the whole entire point. The whole entire point was to improve on a dark room and make a game that I felt was better. That was the point. However, I would like to keep mechanics that work. So the movement mechanics where you have water in a dark room and food, which is also your health, those are interesting mechanics. Again, I complained a bit about the movement, basically it not giving you any real feedback and it being a bit obnoxious to constantly be doing the math on what your movement is and whatnot, and suddenly running out of water when you're not paying attention, because again, early game it did not punish you for running out of water. That was one of my problems. But regardless, the water and the food cost as movement mechanics I actually think are decent mechanics. It's just how they were implemented that's a little bit of a problem, but we've got to implement that in our game. And the water, it's easy enough to just say fuel. Okay, so water is fuel, no problem for our ship that we're flying here. The health as repair thing is a little bit more awkward, and I can justify it. You know, it's one of those things: space debris, radiation, deteriorating the hull. You know, we can provide a whole bunch of explanations for that, but it is a little bit awkward. So this is where I'm at right now. I'm not 100% happy with the move repair stuff, but that's where we're at. Otherwise, this will, at the moment, function the same way as a dark room, which is -1 water fuel per movement and -half a repair kit or food in a dark room. As you can see here, because this is a constant, the repair kit, and right now we're calling it repair bot, because that's a constant in our inventory, we're just always going to have that at 0. So as things go in and out of our inventory, that array is going to change, right? However, I'm going to write the code so that when something hits 0, it normally falls out of the inventory. The game just takes it out of inventory. However, with the repair bot, it will not, and therefore repair bot will always be inventory item 0, the first item in the inventory. So that's an important design note that I'm putting out there right now. And now we can look at transport, because that is the next thing that had to be implemented, and I gave a good bit of thought to. So that is underneath equipment.js. There we go. We'll get back to weight in a second. Down here, all the way at the bottom, is transport. So, transport, one of those things, that is just a cart. You know, we had a cart, a wagon, whatever it was in a dark room, so that this is our version of it. And as far as I could remember, and again, did a bit of thinking, I believe we just basically had a max water level and a capacity for the wagon. Those are the only two things. And the water level always got topped off whenever you hit a house, an outpost, whatever it was, or home. So it's one of these things where it can maintain its own reactor power level, and we'll just update that as necessary. We don't need to put this on the player character. So that's the deal so far, and I spent maybe 10 minutes, which was probably a little too long, but coming up with just some 3 basic types here. So lugger, brig, and barge being our 3 sizes of cart, quote-unquote cart. And then over here in equipment.js, just a real quick and dirty 10, 15, 20 on both. One of those things, I could look at a dark room to see what their balance was. I just hammered that out really quick. That doesn't necessarily mean anything to me, to be honest. But once we have the ship in place, we do have a capacity to worry about. So the next thing was adding weights to all these, to everything, well, to items and armor, and then a fifth item type, quote unquote item type, equipment type, I should say, a fifth equipment type, which I am calling resources. And it's resources because, as you know from a dark room, you'd have things, you could pick up resources that you could otherwise generate in town. So in town, you might have your traps, and your traps could get you scales and teeth, but you can also pick those up out on the road. And they have weights too, so we got to keep track of the weights, even though most of the time they actually just act as currency. So even though they're kind of a currency, a resource to spend on stuff in town, you technically can get them into your inventory on the map screen, which means that they need to be here in equipment. Well, not necessarily here in equipment, they could be in a different file, but they need to have a weight feature as well. Now, along those lines, I am considering basically creating an equipment class and then subtyping and having that have ID and weight as its two attributes, and then subtyping weapon type, item type, and resources off of that, just so that I don't have to keep on having this dot weight on everything. But that's probably overkill, which is why I haven't done it yet, which is why I did not pull the trigger on that. Otherwise, once we have the weight in place here, and I did not actually implement the resource class yet. One of those things, just did not get as much done today as I feel I probably should have, but we are setting ourselves on a time limit, so had to stop. Regardless, once we had those weights in there, then I put this getter in here for weight. And this is player's carry weight, as you can see. And for right now, I'm just going through each of these equipment items on the player character and just adding them together. There are definitely other ways to do this. Today was a little bit of a lazy day, so just for weapon and equipment, dot weapons, add it to weight. Same thing with items, same thing with resources. So that was the sum total of those changes, and I think that might be the sum total of all the changes. Let me just run through really quick. I did mention vision. I did mention that that's the reason why I created the new character type, the player character, which then calls a combat character to create itself. So we did cover that, and I'm looking at equipment. We talked about that. So I do think we are caught up. Again, not as much as I would like to have gotten done, but it's one of those things. It is what it is. Some days you are not going to get done as much as you wanted to. So instead of having the solid half an hour that we've had for the past 2 weeks, has it been 2 weeks since I started this? I just kind of said that off the top of my head, but where's the readme? Let's see. The 29th is when I started. It is the 7th now. So actually, it's only been a week and a couple days. So, 27th. There we go. 27th. So a week and a half. We are at a week and a half now. So in a week and a half, I mean, it's one of those things. Yes, shortest stream in a week and a half, but at the same time, been doing pretty good otherwise. So not behind the 8 ball or anything like that. I think we're making good progress. Just one of those things. Progress dips every once in a while. And just part of life. No big deal. So, session 7 will be starting up next. And one of these things, actually, I will say, is I don't know. I know I said that it was probably going to go map, and then once we got the basics of the map down, events. But ever since I started map in this session, I've kind of been feeling like I want to actually do the home base first. So your stuff like building houses, building traps, collecting firewood, that kind of stuff in the darkroom. I almost want to get that because that's part of the core gameplay loop. Yeah, not sure why my tongue decided to screw that one up, but that's part of the core gameplay loop, and therefore I kind of want to get that hammered out first. I don't have a good explanation for why, because the fact of the matter is that walking around the map is also part of the core gameplay loop. So I'm not sure what exactly. I think maybe the reason why I want to get that taken care of is because that is probably a bigger section of the game mechanics, because not only do you have building, a basically functionality where you develop your town, right? You have functionality where you develop your town, but you also have timers for your firewood and your traps, which honestly I think could be developed a little bit more. I think you could probably fit a few more types into there to allow a little bit of a different gameplay option. And then you also have the base management of moving your meeples around, which also are on their own timer. So I think, and then actually beyond that, the actual buying additional equipment in town. So I think the reason why I'm thinking that I should be starting there just on instinctual level instead of going through this map stuff is actually probably because I recognize at some level that it's a lot more than it seems like. It's a lot more coding than it actually seems like. So I may dip on the map at this point and come back to it later. Part of me, so another big part that I really need to look into, because I've never actually done it before, is this pseudo random map generation. I've never actually dived into that before, and I'm not actually sure, I'm not actually sure whether or not I count that towards the session. So that could legit be 2 or 3 hours of me just reading up various articles, watching various tutorials, reading various tutorials, Technically, that's part of the game development, right? Like, research is part of game development. I don't stop the timer when I hop on MDN to check JavaScript functions and element, properties. I don't stop the timer when I'm reading documentation. So part of me feels like I shouldn't stop the timer for researching basically different ways to generate a pseudo-random map. But at the same time, that would literally mean that I would have a session, a 2-hour session, where I just hop on stream and say, and nothing got done. I mean, sure, I could come on and say, okay, this is stuff I looked at, this is stuff I learned, etc., etc., etc. I could do stuff like that, but the main purpose of this is largely code review, just looking at what I've written, and if I'm not actually writing anything, then that's not quite in the spirit of it. So one of these deals, that may be something. So back to, if I do the main base first, the home base functionality gameplay loop, if I do that first, the clicker stuff, then at that point I may have justification to say, okay, look, we've got a large portion of the game written, especially actually if I add on to the home base stuff, if I go from that and instead of back to map over to events. So if I go from home base to events, and then the very, very last thing is just map exploration, then at that point, that will be so many sessions of 2-hour sessions that I can get away with saying, look, now we are getting to the point where CSS is going to be up next, developing the web page is going to be up next. So we're going to move on to less uniform sessions, less stringent session requirements. So at that point, I can go ahead and say, okay, finding out how to do the map took me 4 hours. Here's what I've written to get the map done. And then, okay, after we got the map done, it took me 4 hours to CSS the map and display it on screen. All right, there we go. So that may be the game plan. I'm thinking that's the game plan. And yeah, sounds good to me. So with that extra 5-minute ramble, we did manage to get to 25 minutes, which is a lot better than 20 minutes and a lot closer to 30 minutes. So I'm happy with that. And if you manage to stick through that ramble, now you know what's going on in the future, so look forward to it. And if you have been watching, thank you. And as always, I don't think there's anything else. So I hope you have a great and wonderful day, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're in the world. And I'll catch you next time.